Okay, but help out all of our students and our profs out there that are saying, hey, that's all I've ever known. What would make me open the door to that possibility being a real one?
I think it's important to see that the question isn't, are we going to be open to the possibility of miracles, so much as the question is, what justification do you have for being closed to the possibility of miracles? You see, as long as the existence of God is even possible, then it's possible that He's acted in history. If there is a transcendent creator and designer of the universe, then clearly performing miracles would be child's play for such a being. So as long as God's existence is even possible, we have to be open to the possibility that He's acted in history. So the real burden of proof here is on the person who denies the possibility of miracles. What justification is there for saying that before we sit down at the table and look at the evidence, we're going to throw supernatural hypotheses out the window without even looking at them first? That's the question.
Didn't David Hume then bring in the answer, which was, hey, my experience tells me that's all that happens?
Hume's argument, in a nutshell, is that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. Now, at first that may sound very commonsensical and true, but probability theorists from Condorcet to John Stuart Mill, studying the problem of how you establish the historicity of highly improbable events, have shown that Hume's presupposition is demonstrably false. Otherwise, if Hume were correct, you could never be rational in believing a report on the morning news that the winning pick in last night's lottery was a certain number, because that is an extraordinarily improbable event, and therefore you should never believe any report of such a thing. But clearly that's ridiculous. Something has obviously gone wrong. And what probability theorists realized was that in establishing the probability of an event, you must consider more than simply the inherent probability of that event. You also have to take into account the probability of the evidence being just as it is if that event had not taken place. And thus, in the case of the evening news, what is the probability that this winning pick would be reported on the evening news if that event had not taken place? Well, if that's low enough, that offsets any improbability in the event itself. So, with respect to the miracles and the resurrection of Jesus, the question would be, what is the probability that we should have things like the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, the sudden origin of the disciples' faith in God's having raised Jesus from the dead, if in fact the resurrection had not occurred? And when you consider that evidence in the mix, then it's not at all true that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. That's simply a false presupposition behind Hume's argument.
Define probability. What is it in terms of historic probability?
Historians actually don't like to talk about probability in a technical sense. Now, in a loose and everyday sense, it simply means what is most likely to have occurred, what's the best explanation. But you see, historical hypotheses are very difficult to assess in terms of giving actual probability estimates to them, like, say, the chances of this are 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 25. That's just impossible to do. For example, what's the probability of the resurrection occurring? Well, it seems to me that's inscrutable. We don't know what God's will is. For all we know, the probability that God would resurrect Jesus from the dead might be extremely high. We simply have no way of knowing. So what historians do in justifying their historical hypotheses is not calculate the probabilities of these hypotheses. Rather, they weigh them by certain criteria, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, the accord with accepted beliefs, the degree to which the hypothesis is contrived or ad hoc. And then they compare that with the success of rival hypotheses in meeting these criteria. And that hypothesis which best meets these criteria is the one that deserves to be accepted.